and it's always a pleasure to be here. Learning a lot from you, lifetime learning. Most of you here, one way or the other, heard my story about me. So what I would like to do is I would summarize a very, very short summary of who I am and who I was, mainly. And then I want to focus on one thing, which is really my passion, which is small group. And because we don't have much time, so I would leave the other things that I thought maybe for some other time. I was involved in the student movement in Ethiopia and Eritrea together at that time, by the way, when they were the same, when they were under one country. I became involved when I was middle school student. And then when I was in high school, I became involved very much so to the extent of being in the leadership of the student union. And then when I was 17 in college, I became a communist by way of studying communist ideology. And at that time, this is in the beginning of 1970s, and communism was a sort of a fashion in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, most of these countries. So communism was in the air there. So especially among the young generation, everybody wants to be a communist. And not only that, communism, experientially speaking, communism did some things, changed nations actually, in some countries, like China, Vietnam, Cuba, Albania, and so on and so forth. And even here in Africa, like Tanzania, Mozambique, and the South African Party, people like Mandela. So communism was there among the new generation, among the young generation. And we followed suit. And we became communists by way of studying. But what happened was when I was in the transition from high school, the end of high school to college, 5 students, 5 friends, trusted friends, started thinking about how to change our country, Ethiopia. How to transform it. And how to get out of poverty, how to establish democracy, and so on and so forth. And at that time, there was an emperor. It was ruled by a king. So we hated that emperor, that king imperial system. And we started talking about how to change Ethiopia. So that became our vision. And students in the university, even our superiors, our elders in the universities also had that movement. So at some point, we said communism is a way to change Ethiopia. And we took ourselves as 5 students as core group of people. And we started thinking how to change, not only ideologically, but also organizationally. So we started a small group. We called ourselves cell groups. And later on, when we became communists, we called it communist cell groups. And our goal was to change Ethiopia, as I said, but within that, our strategy was to take the student movement or the movement of the youngsters at the time from a day-to-day triggering issues out of that and take the movement to a strategic position of changing the system of Ethiopia. That was our goal. This was our strategy, and our goal was, of course, to change Ethiopia. Why we take this strategy was that at the time, the student movement, even though it was radical and very powerful student movement, in fact, in the world, in the whole world, one of the powerful student movements in the world was Ethiopian student movements, as I said, including the Eritrean students at that time. And the Iranian students, the other one. It was very powerful. And of course, the Chinese students. These were very radical students' unions, organized, well organized, and well envisioned to change their nations. So we came as a core group, 5 of us. And of course, there were also other core groups in the universities, even our superiors, and also in other places. Later on, down the line, we connected ourselves into networks. But here I want to focus on the small groups, how we did the small groups. So 5 of us, we said which kind of form of organization we said we have to follow. And we studied other movements in some other countries. And we found out that there are 2 kinds of small group organizations. One type was called a spider web organization. So there is a core group here at the center as a leadership, as a leading one. And then this core group will have different cell groups. And so on. So it creates a kind of a spider web. This is 1-4. It's hierarchical, basically, because there is a center here, and this center is connected to these centers, and these centers connected to other centers, and so on. This is one type. The other type of organization is called a starship organization. And as you know, starship, starfish. As you know, starfish, if you cut here, this will continue as a fish. If you cut it here, it will continue as a fish. It doesn't die, it doesn't vanish. So if you, for example, this is the center of the starfish, but if you cut this one, it goes on and it starts its own growth with a center and become a starfish, and so on. So we said we have to follow a starfish organization. And it was not actually an organization, but it's a type of organization that's called organism. Just like an organism, a biological organism thing, like an amoeba. So we said we have to follow this. Why? Because our situation in the country, there was no democracy. There was no freedom of association, freedom of organization, freedom of speech, freedom. If ever you say something against the king, you are done, you are finished. Either you are in prison or killed. And if you are caught having an organization, a political or some kind of a movement, then you are done. So because of that, we said we have to follow a starfish organization type, an organism. Because whatever is done by the government, whether at the center or in one of the branches of the cell group, then the movement continues. There are a lot of centers, not one center. It's not hierarchical. It's just a relatively, comparatively autonomous kind of movement, and it's ideal for creating a movement. And within 2 years, the movement covered, with this kind of organism, covered almost all the cities of Ethiopia. Not only that, we listed out our priorities, to reach out to priorities of, like, for example, we said the number one priority, and we said the top, at the top of the society of the nation, and at the below the nation at the ground level. So at the top, we said the number one is government, and down here, maybe 5 or 6 of the list is education or school. So we listed out 3, 4, 5 priority places that we conquer through our cell groups. And we started doing that. And just as an example from the government, the vice president of the Ethiopian government became our member of the underground cell group.
The vice president today?
No, at that time. So what happened is in 1974, through this movement, we created a revolution. In 1974 became crazy in Ethiopia. I mean, the whole Ethiopian population, just like the Gen Z kind of in Kenya. So, but much more than that. Because the Gen Z movement now is mainly the young generation movement, but at that time it started with the Gen Z, but it spread out to be an all-out social movement. And because of that, the king was overthrown and a military government took power as a coup d'etat. Using our movement, the military took over. 120 officers, military officers, organized themselves, and using their weapons, military, they took power. They killed the king, and they became governors. They became the leaders of the nation. I want to emphasize, using our movement. They didn't do anything. They just came out. They took our slogans, and they started saying the same thing that we say. So the people said yes, and then they took power. At first, during this movement, during the revolution, they were protecting us, the military. They were even protecting us not to be killed, not to be imprisoned, and so on. For example, when the government sends a police force, when we do demonstrations or things, the military comes and they defend us. But later on, they took power and they started killing us. That is what happens in many places when there are movements that we have to take care of it. And then we continued our movement against the military dictatorship anyways. We continued, and they continued killing us too. So when I say the vice president, it was the vice president of that military dictatorship that became our underground movement. And that's just an example. But we penetrated with this movement, we penetrated into several government places, in parliaments, in the judiciary, and in the executive, like the vice president. So we recruited many parliamentarians as our underground cell group members. And then we went to different public services, like, for example, educational ministry, mainly. And then we also went to the private sector and had members from the private sector, from the business. We also penetrated the army with our underground cell groups. What happened, in fact, later on when we started our armed struggle, guerrilla warfare, we started our guerrilla warfare in 1977-78. What happened was there was this elite airborne army of Ethiopia at the time. And that elite airborne army was established by the American army. And many of the officers, the leaders of that army, they were trained in the US, and they were elite leaders. So we penetrated that army with these cell groups, and we had, including the main commander of the airborne army and other officers, they were our underground members of the cell groups. And what happened later on, in 1979, after we went to the mountains and we started guerrilla warfare, this army, about 500 something people, airborne army, all of them, they defected from the government and they joined us, led by the leader, who was a lieutenant colonel at that time. Why I brought this is that this movement can penetrate and conquer everywhere in the society. At the bottom, we focused on schools, high schools and universities in our priority list. So what we did was, from the government, which is the upper level, and from schools, universities and high schools from the lower level, because both is important. Both was important for us. Working at the students' level down there and working in the government up there. Of course, there are others in between. Like, as I said, private businessmen, business people, business sector, and workers in the factories, even though there were not many factories at the time, workers in modern agriculture sector, even though there were not many. So those were somewhere in between. But then the military government, as they continued killing us, we couldn't continue in the urban movement. Our movement was urban, in the cities and small towns. But we couldn't continue because tyrannic things that were happening from the government. So we changed our strategy from the urban to the rural. And 17 of us, we went to the mountains of Ethiopia, in northern Ethiopia, and started guerrilla warfare with only 2 guns. And we started recruiting young people, students again, and teachers and others, farmers, young farmers, and start politicize them and give them training, military training, and we start organizing and a military organization. And we fought for 15 years. After 15 years, we took power in 1991, defeating that military government. In fact, the president was called Mengistu Haile Mariam. He still lives in Zimbabwe, fled in 1991. And we defeated that military government, and we took power. So my friend became president, and I became prime minister, the second person in charge of the economy. So we started trying to build up Ethiopia into a socialist, because we were communists. a socialist society. And after about, long story short, after about 2 years, 2+ years, I realized that communism is not working. It's not working, I said for myself. And I became doubtful about that. And I wanted to change it. And in between this, also I studied from England an MBA course in economic management, and that completely changed my mind from a communist ideology to a free market ideology. And I started doing, again, a kind of movement to change the whole policy into a free market economy, but at that time, it didn't work. Because my own best friend knew about that, and they put me to jail. And I was in prison for 12 years in solitary confinement. I was not allowed to see even my wife and our 2 children. And by then, I was not a communist. I abandoned that, but I was still an atheist. So in hopelessness, in a total hopelessness, I even tried to commit suicide twice while I was in prison. And after 5 years, at the end of the 5th year, something miraculous and radical happened in my life. I met Jesus while I was in prison. And in 3 nights in a row, I met him. Well, I usually say he found me, actually. He met me, because he's the one who came and told me to follow him. He said, I am Jesus. Believe in me and follow me. If you believe and follow me, I am the only one who can give you a new life. And it was a time where I was asking and probing and thinking what life is, what the meaning of life is, and so on. So that became, an answer for my question. And I started following Jesus in that way. I started following Jesus, and I became a Jesus follower. I became a disciple of Jesus. When I became a disciple of Jesus, one transformative thing that happened in me was to my mind and my heart. I became a totally different person. For that matter, I already abandoned communism. I said it's not worth it. So I didn't, I stopped following communism. But I was in a limbo. What way to go, what to follow. And following, by the way, is not only, it's not a religious thing as such. Following is a thing that you believe in, and everybody, human beings, want that. A human being always looks for something to have faith on and something to follow. So when I was young, I followed communism. I followed the creators of communists. My gods were Karl Marx, Lenin, Stalin, and so on. Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, and so on. But when I was in prison and abandoned that faith, I was a faithless person. I became an atheist, but even an atheist has faith, but I became a faithless person. That's why I started asking where to go and what to do. And Jesus became the answer. And I started following him earnestly. And that changed my mind. And that changed my heart. The whole communist ideology started to be washed away the more I started studying and reading and praying the Bible. And the more I studied Jesus, the life of Jesus, the more I became passionate about small groups. Why? Because I found out that Jesus is the first one who used small groups in his movement. And Jesus, as I said earlier this morning, is not a Christianity. He is a movement. Jesus didn't create Christianity. He created a movement of a kingdom of God, a system, a different kind, a totally different kind, crazy kind. But it's a movement. So I became fascinated with him, how he did his movement. He did his movement with this. In fact, the church abandoned his way of the movement, creating a movement, and who took his model? The mafias, the communists. They took his model and they implemented, exercised it, and they did it effectively for their own cause, of course, not for the kingdom of God. So I became fascinated when I studied his life and how he did things and how he transformed first the life of an individual, which is me. He started from me, and then he wanted, of course, he called me and you, all of us who are believers, to take over his way of movement. But we are not doing it effectively so far. Some of us, maybe most of us, most of the Christian community, took it to mean a religious thing to be. So it failed. People took the movement and the model of Jesus from the nature of Jesus, from the nature of his spirit, and put it into buildings like this one and called it church, and failed. But the Jesus movement, the kingdom of God, can change not only a person like myself, but it can change a society. It's not politics as such, but it includes that. It's more than politics. It's more than economics. It's more than sociology and so on and so forth. Because it transforms the whole thing into a new way of thinking, a new way of doing, and a new way of taking a perspective in relationships. That's what we failed to understand when we become disciples of Jesus. So I became very much fascinated about how it worked, how Jesus worked. Even more than I was a communist, because now I knew, while I was in prison, that these communists took his model and did it and passed it to us. We learned, by the way, this communist cell group method from the Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and so on. But we didn't know that it was Jesus. I only discovered that it was the Jesus model while I was in prison. That's why I became fascinated and passionate about small groups. I said, it worked when I was a communist to change a nation, even though we failed because we followed the communist way. Okay, that's what we failed. Had it been the Jesus way, that nation would have been transformed by now. But if it works there, it should be working with the whole vision of the kingdom of God to change and transform a nation. That's why I became fascinated with this small group thing. Doing small group needs a vision, of course, a higher vision, and a sustainable vision, a long-lasting kind of vision, not just triggering issues, triggering points here and there. If we run after triggering points, we don't transform a nation. We can use those triggering positions, but our ultimate goal must be to transform a nation, to get into the system of what we are in and start doing our own kingdom of God system in a Jesus way and take time and change the society. That's what we have to do now. And it works. It may take time, but it works. I may not see in my lifetime changing some nations in Africa, but definitely it works. My children may see, or my grandchildren may see that, and that's okay. And it's peaceful. It's not with gun, like I did. And I don't advise guns now, never. I don't advise violent means. I only advise peaceful means, just like Jesus did. But a peaceful movement of the Jesus way. And piece by piece, step by step, build up so that it would come into transformation. And this way, by the way, we were using, when we used in Ethiopia this model, we were using also for triggering things. The student movement in Ethiopia, when it started, it was a question and an issue of bread and butter issue in the campuses. Let our bread do, increase this much, these kinds of things. And it was like an exercise, getting exercise books or getting textbooks and so on. So one of our aims was to take, as I said, to take that, the student from that issue and take it to the main issue of transforming. But we use those triggering issues, not as at the end, and an end to itself, but just use as a tactical way to get to a strategic things and to get to our goals. We use that. For example, and at that time there was no social media. It was the maximum thing was telephone calls, and it was this this ancient call, telephone, or mails, or word of mouth. That was it. Today it's another thing. But we were able to communicate ourselves. For example, what we were doing was we were distributing leaflets in the cities. And using this network, we distribute leaflets just in one night. We distribute the same kinds of leaflets all over the cities in the country in the same night using this. Using our this model, we have, as I said, as I told you, members, for example, get into courts as judges, or judges in the courts become our members of cell groups. And those guys, they were doing their jobs, fairly towards our goals. As I said, the vice president was he was one of the military officers. He was a colonel, by the way, and he was our member. And being there, nobody knows his colleagues. Of course, later on, they found out that he was our cell members, and he was killed. But he was giving us informations, top level informations about many things. For example, if the government wants to imprison some of our leaders or our members, he tells us, being there. He leaks the information for us. Things like that. If we want, for example, university students, the whole university to withdraw and to get out for some time, then we could do that using our networks. So we could do many things. At some point, towards the end of 78, about 90% of the capital, Addis Ababa, the capital, local administration down there became our cell members. Without the government knowing at first, of course. So we can do these kinds of things with this network. But all the time, our goal was to change and transform the nation, step by step. I think it's enough here. I had one more issue, but for the time is not allowing me, so I will do it maybe some other